My name is Eleanor, and I'm 75 years old. For most of my life, I clung to a beautiful lie that if you pour boundless love into your children, it will return to you when your hair turns silver. That belief was my lifeline, my comfort, my everything. But now, I know the chilling truth. Sometimes, love doesn't echo back the way you give it. And the most dangerous deceptions are the ones we tell ourselves. I had a simple dream, a quiet seat at my son's table, a warm meal, and the feeling of still mattering. I believed it would be enough. Then an unexpected sum of money, $185,000, 0 cents, appeared, a gift from the land my ancestors tilled. This wasn't earned, it was inherited, a piece of history I felt compelled to use wisely. My son, Mark, called, inviting me to Chicago, promising a new beginning. Hope swelled, quiet and fragile, as I packed my life into a small bag, clutching a hidden passbook, a secret I hoped would secure my place, not buy it. Little did I know the biggest battle for my dignity was about to begin, not in the quiet fields of Tennessee, but behind the closed doors of my own son's home. I was born in a sleepy little town called Harmony Creek, nestled deep in the heart of Tennessee. It wasn't even on most maps, just rows of cornfields, a few dusty roads, and the sound of chickens scratching in the dirty yard. Summers there smelled like sweat and pond water. Winters meant chopping wood until your hands bled. But it was home, a place where kids played with sticks, not screens, where neighbors called through windows, not phone. My father named me Eleanor. He said it means heart. You'll be the heart of this family someday. At the time, I rolled my eyes. I thought it sounded too sentimental. But now I feel every beat of that name deep in my chest. I did become the heart, quietly pumping life into everyone else while no one stopped to check if I was tired. I grew up in a wooden house my father built with his own hands. The walls were thin and the roof leaked when it rained, but there was laughter in that house. Real laughter, the kind that echoed through the kitchen while biscuits baked and dogs barked in the yard. I didn't have much, not toys, not pretty clothes, but I had warmth. I had people who looked me in the eye and saw me. Then came David. I met him at the church picnic when I was 17. He wasn't flashy, just a quiet boy with work-worn hands and a gentle way of listening. He brought me a slice of watermelon and said, "You have a nice smile, Miss Eleanor." That was it. That was the start of everything. We married under a tree behind his family's barn. I wore a borrowed dress that smelled like lavender and age. Our wedding feast was nothing more than ham sandwiches and cornbread I baked myself. But I felt like the richest girl in Harmony Creek as I had David, and that was all I ever really wanted. Together we built a life, a small one, a hard one, but it was ours. David worked 3 jobs during the factory strikes. Days at the plant, nights unloading freight, weekends fixing roofs for cash. I kept house and raised our 3 babies. We didn't eat if the kids weren't fed first. Sometimes David would skip dinner entirely and say, "Let him grow strong. We'll be okay." I still remember the night we realized we were out of heating oil in the dead of winter. David wrapped the kids in all the blankets we had, then pulled me close under his coat. We shivered together until morning. That was marriage, not candlelight dinners, but surviving the cold as a team. Then came the cancer. Out of nowhere, one day he had a pain in his side. 2 months later, the doctor said the words that cracked my world open. Stage 4. Nothing we can do. I sold our truck I borrowed from the church fund. I sat by his side as he shrank into someone I barely recognized. He never once complained. The night before he died, he touched my face and whispered, "Promise me you'll eat well and don't work yourself to death." I nodded, even though my throat burned too much to speak. He passed away the next morning. The room was quiet except for my breathing and the sound of my heart breaking. It was the coldest day of the year. Snow covered the garden he once planted, now wilted and gray. I wore the same black coat I'd worn to my mother's funeral. After the burial, I came home to an empty house. His boots still sat by the door. His coffee mug was still in the sink. But the man who made that house feel like a home was gone. No pension, no savings, no one left but the kids. That's when I told myself, it's okay. I still have our children. I'll live for them now. I didn't need luxury. I didn't dream of cruises or condos. All I wanted was a seat at their table, a quiet room in their home, a warm meal shared with family who remembered I mattered. I truly believed that was enough. God help me, I truly believed that was enough. That morning started like any other, deceptively ordinary. I was standing by the stove, waiting for the kettle to boil, scooping instant coffee into my chipped blue mug, the same one I'd used for 15 years. The kitchen window was open just a crack, letting in the early spring air, still damp with dew. Birds were chirping somewhere out near the fence post. Then came the knock, short and sharp, like someone who didn't plan on staying long. I opened the door to find a man in a beige windbreaker holding a clipboard. He introduced himself as someone from the county's land development office. I squinted against the sun as he pointed out to the field next to my house. The little patch of land with a leaning fence and wildflowers that bloomed on their own schedule. It used to be my parents'. My daddy planted corn there when I was a girl, and later it just sat quiet, untouched except for the occasional rabbit trail cutting through the tall grass. He cleared his throat, said something about a new federal highway cutting through this part of Tennessee. Eminent domain compensation. My ears didn't quite catch everything at first, not until he said the number. $185,000, 0 cents. I sat down before I even realized I needed to, my hands folded on my lap, fingers tightening. The numbers echoed in my head like church bells on Sunday morning. I hadn't seen that many zeros in my entire life. $185,000, 0 cents. I never imagined. For a moment, it didn't feel real, like he'd gotten the wrong address, like maybe I was still asleep and dreaming in the armchair by the radio. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table in silence. The kettle had gone cold. My coffee still sat dry in the mug. This wasn't money I'd earned. I hadn't worked for it, hadn't bled or sweated or saved to make it appear. This was land passed down from folks who came long before me, folks who had dirt under their nails and hope in their chests. I thought of my father's voice, the way he used to hum while turning the soil, the way my mother used to press corn husks into bundles for drying. This wasn't mine, not really. It was theirs, and I had to do right by it. I didn't tell anyone at first, not even Sarah, my neighbor who sometimes dropped by with peach cobbler. I tucked the official letter into the back of my recipe book behind the page for chicken pot pie. I wasn't ready to say it out loud, afraid the words might turn the money into something dangerous. Later that afternoon, the phone rang. The screen lit up. Mark. My heart jumped. He hadn't called in months. Not since Christmas, and even then, just a quick "love you, Mom," and gone again. I picked it up, my thumb trembling slightly as I slid across the screen. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice soft like he'd been thinking about this for a while. "How are you doing out there? Still getting around okay?" I smiled without meaning to. "I'm doing all right, sweetheart. Still kicking." Then, after a pause, he said, "Listen, I was thinking, why don't you come stay with us for a while? I know it's a small place, but we can make room. It's time you stopped living alone." Something caught in my throat. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear those words, that someone was thinking of me, not just as a mother or a grandmother, but as someone worth having around. I closed my eyes for a second and let his voice fill the quiet. The kitchen didn't feel so empty all of a sudden. I thought back to when Mark was little, how he used to wait on the front steps when I worked the late shift at the bakery, clutching a brown bag of donated rolls in his tiny flashlight. He never complained, not once, just wrapped his arms around me when I got home and asked, "Did you eat yet, Mama?" Maybe now was my turn to sit on someone else's porch, to be wrapped in warmth again. After the call, I stayed at the table a long time. My coffee had gone cold twice by then. I smiled to myself, the kind of smile you hide even when you're alone. "I'll go," I whispered, "but I'll pack light. I won't be a burden." Mark must have sensed it because he said, "Don't say that, Mom. You're my mother. A simple sentence, but to me it was everything. A recognition, a belonging, proof that I was still more than just someone who used to matter. The next morning, I opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. The smell of mothballs and thyme hit me like a memory. I folded a few dresses, tucked in the scarf David had given me for our 30th anniversary, a pale wool thing I'd only worn once, too nice for daily use. I wrapped our wedding photo in a towel and slid it between two sweaters. The corners were fading, but David's eyes still looked at me the same, steady. Last, I took the savings passbook from the top drawer and slipped it into the side pocket of my fabric purse. It still had my name on it. I hadn't told anyone about it yet, not Mark, not his wife. I wasn't hiding it, I just needed to hold on to something that was mine, just for a while longer. Maybe I'd help them later if they needed it. Maybe I'd offer to fix up their kitchen or chip in for the girls' college funds. But first, I needed to carry it to remember that I had something left that didn't come from giving, something that came from being. The morning light streamed through the kitchen as I zipped up my bag. The birds were still singing, the house still creaked in the same places. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was leaving. Not out of necessity, but out of hope. The next morning, I left Harmony Creek on a northbound bus that smelled faintly of vinyl and gasoline. I didn't carry much, just a small backpack slung over my shoulder and a cloth bag clutched to my chest. Inside it were the things that made me feel like myself. A jar of homemade peach preserves, a little container of peanut butter I'd stirred by hand with honey, and 3 sachets of herbal tea made from lemon balm and mint growing wild along the edge of my garden. My hands had packed them with care. I didn't want to arrive empty-handed, even if I was just a guest. I was still a mother, still a grandmother. That meant something. The bus rumbled along the highway, bouncing over potholes as the landscape slowly shifted. The endless fields of Tennessee corn gave way to scrubland, then to brick buildings, faded billboards, and finally, the wide gray sprawl that meant we were nearing Chicago. I watched it all pass by through a smudged window. The sun glinted off the metal roof of a barn, the last familiar thing before the city swallowed us whole. My fingers tightened around the cloth bag in my lap. I whispered to myself, wherever my children are, that's where I belong. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. By the time the driver called our stop, the air outside had turned hot and thick, like breathing through cotton. Chicago's summer didn't feel like Harmony Creek summer. It wasn't the kind of heat that made you sweat under a porch fan while sipping iced tea. This was hard heat, heavy, the kind that stuck to your back and made your knees ache. I stepped off the bus and blinked into the sun. The station was little more than a shaded bench on the edge of a parking lot. Its fall shimmered under the weight of the noon sun. My shoes, good leather ones I'd polished the night before, felt too tight. I had imagined this moment so many times, but I hadn't prepared for how sharp the world would feel outside my quiet little town. My bag was heavier than I remembered. I slung the backpack behind me and held the cloth parcel in both arms, trying not to squint too hard. I looked around for Mark. People were rushing past, men in colored shirts with briefcases, women talking on phones, a boy selling water bottles out of a cooler, but no sign of my son. I found a spot in the shade beneath a crooked metal awning, sat down slowly on the bench and folded my hands over the cloth bag. I could feel the jar of peach preserve still warm from the sun. I hoped the seal had held. I imagined handing it to my granddaughter. Would she like it? Would she remember that Grandma Eleanor came from a place where peaches still grew on trees? I glanced down at my watch. It was nearly 20 minutes past noon. Maybe he hit traffic. Maybe he forgot. No, I told myself, he wouldn't forget. I adjusted my scarf and tried to smooth the front of my blouse, now damp with sweat. I should have brought a hat. I hadn't traveled this far from home in nearly 15 years. Back then, it was for David's funeral. A low honk startled me. Mark pulled up in an old pickup that coughed once before sputtering to a stop. When he stepped out, I barely recognized the boy I once cradled on my hip. His hair, once the color of corn silk in the summer sun, was now streaked with gray. Deep, tired creases marked his forehead. I hadn't noticed them in the photos he occasionally texted. I touched his cheek when he leaned in to hug me. "You've aged, sweetheart," I almost whispered, though I bit my tongue. It wasn't judgment, just the ache of seeing how time had burdened him. I told myself then and there, I'm here to ease things, not add to the weight. The ride through the Chicago streets was jarring. I sat quietly in the passenger seat, hands folded in my lap, my bag at my feet. My eyes darted left and right at the blur of honking cars, cyclists weaving like thread through rush hour, and pedestrians shouting into their phones. "Traffic's something else up here," I said with a shaky laugh. Mark chuckled. "Yeah, you get used to it." But I wasn't sure I ever would. Still, sitting beside him, hearing his voice was like balm on a burn I didn't know I'd been carrying. When we pulled into the apartment complex, my breath caught a little. A narrow brick building with faded green railings, cracked pavement, and a row of overstuffed trash bins by the side. The place had known better years. I didn't say a word. We climbed the stairs. 3 flights, no elevator. I told him I was fine, though my knees ached with each step, and my breath came shorter than I liked. I clutched the cloth bag close to my chest, careful not to bump it against the railing. It was silly, but I kept thinking about the preserves and the peanut butter inside, as if they'd break and spill, and along with them something of me. When we reached the door, it was already ajar. Sarah stood in the hallway, barefoot, one hand stirring something on the stove, and the other thumbing her phone. She glanced up briefly. "Oh, hi." "You're here," she said, her voice flat, already drifting back into her scrolling. I smiled anyway and held out the jar. "I brought peach jam, thought the kids might like it." She gave a half nod and placed it on the counter without looking. The living room was cramped. Toys everywhere, plastic dinosaurs, stuffed bears, puzzle pieces underfoot. A blaring TV fought with the sound of boiling water. The baby wailed from the next room. Sarah raised her voice. "Quiet down! Grandma's here!" I winced. I wasn't expecting a welcome banner, but something about the way she said "grandma" made me feel like a stranger. The next morning, I woke early, long before anyone else. My body ached from the climb, from the unfamiliar bed, from the sudden change in air. Still, I swept the floor, wiped down the counters, folded a basket of clean clothes sitting on the couch. No one had asked me to, but it felt good to be useful. It always had. In the days that followed, I settled into a quiet rhythm. I took the baby to daycare each morning, bundled in layers he always wriggled out of. I picked him up in the afternoon, fed him mashed sweet potatoes, wiped his little hands, and changed him while he kicked and squealed. I cooked dinner. Nothing fancy, just the simple things I knew. Meatloaf, green beans, cornbread. No one said much during meals, but no one complained either. My back began to act up on the 5th day. A stabbing pain that ran from my shoulder down to my hip. That evening, while scrubbing the bathtub, I had to stop midway and sit on the cold tile. I stayed there for 10 minutes, breathing through it, but when the baby called out, "Grandma, give me a piggyback," I got up. One night over a dinner of baked chicken and rice, I cleared my throat and said softly, "I've got some money from the land back home. Was thinking of putting it into a savings account. Could help with bills, maybe." I wasn't sure how they'd take it. I didn't want them to feel I was buying space, but I also didn't want to sit idle knowing Mark was struggling. Before Mark could say a word, Sarah perked up from her seat, her eyes lighting up for the first time since I'd arrived. "Oh, I can help with that," she said cheerily. "I know someone at the bank. They'll get you a great rate. Just hand over your info. I'll set everything up for you." She smiled. A real smile, the kind that made me think, maybe she's warming up to me after all. I nodded slowly, surprised, unsure whether to feel relieved or wary. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat alone at the kitchen table long after they'd gone to bed, my hands wrapped around a lukewarm mug of chamomile. The apartment was silent now. Toys were tucked away, the baby was asleep. I looked at the jar of jam, still unopened on the shelf. I'm still useful, I told myself. I'm still someone who can help. I didn't notice the shadow forming behind those words, the faint shape of something else, but in that moment, All I saw was a quiet kitchen, the sound of a refrigerator humming, and the image of my son's back bent slightly at the dinner table as he scrolled through bills on his phone. That night, I couldn't sleep. My head throbbed dully, a deep, pulsing ache behind my eyes that refused to go away no matter how I turned on the couch. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the sounds of the city, distant sirens, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of pipes behind the walls. I didn't want to wake anyone, so I slipped the blanket off carefully and tiptoed toward the kitchen. My knees ached with every step, and the floorboards groaned beneath my weight, even though I tried to move like a whisper. It was a habit now, the kind that forms when you live in someone else's house. Walk softly, speak less, disappear when possible. As I passed by Mark and Sarah's bedroom, I heard voices, soft but sharp like the edge of a broken plate. I paused. I should have kept walking, but something about the way Sarah said "Mom" made my feet root to the floor. I wasn't eavesdropping, I told myself that. I just froze. Maybe because some part of me already knew what was coming. Sarah's voice was tight and bitter. "I'm exhausted, Mark. I work all day and then I come home to this. Your mother's here needing everything, and the kids won't leave me alone for a second." My breath caught. I pressed my back to the wall. "She's taken over the living room," Sarah continued. "We don't even have a space to sit anymore. She just sprawls out like she lives here." My hands trembled. That living room, if you could call it that, barely had room for my blanket and a folding chair. I didn't even unpack my second bag. I thought I'd been invisible enough. Then Sarah's voice dipped into something worse. "She keeps talking about helping, about giving us money. Where is it? I haven't seen a single cent." "Just talks and promises like we're supposed to wait around and beg." I felt something twist in my chest. I hadn't told them yet because I didn't know how. The money wasn't just mine. It felt like a relic, a piece of my parents', a sliver of land turned into paper. I wanted to give, but I also wanted to feel like it was my choice. Mark didn't argue. He just sighed, long, tired. "If she leaves," he said, "who's going to watch the kids? Who's going to cook and clean? You want to do all that on top of everything else?" That broke something in me. Not just the words, but the way he said them. As if I wasn't his mother anymore, but a solution, a placeholder, a free maid. Sarah laughed, short, sharp. "So, we just keep her around for convenience? Huh?" I closed my eyes, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. That line, "keep her around," like I was an old lamp someone was too lazy to toss. I felt the heat in my cheeks, but not from shame, from something colder, something like being erased. I stood there behind the wall, listening to my child and his wife carve away my dignity piece by piece. I didn't cry. I couldn't. Even the tears felt ashamed to fall. I turned slowly and crept back down the hallway, the shadows wrapping around me like a blanket that no longer warmed. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, same as always. I brewed coffee, flipped pancakes, sliced apples into tiny wedges, the way the kids liked. My hand shook as I poured hot water for the oatmeal, and a splash landed on the back of my hand. The sting was sharp, but I didn't flinch. I just turned the tap and ran cold water over the burn while my other hand kept stirring. No one noticed, and I preferred it that way. At breakfast, Sarah said thanks without looking up. The kids giggled, sticky with syrup, asking me to tie their shoes. I smiled. I wiped their mouths. I said nothing. Mark didn't speak much either. He never mentioned the money again, never asked about my hand, even though the burn left a red welt. He looked tired. He always did. But now his tiredness felt distant, like he was keeping it for himself, along with whatever pieces of affection he once had for me. When I spoke to him, he just nod or mutter something low, his eyes already somewhere else. The warmth I remembered from my boy, gone. Maybe it had been gone a while and I just hadn't wanted to see it. Every time I sat down for a moment, I'd hear those words again. Keep her here to make use of her, like a scratch record playing in the background of my mind. Always stuck on the same cruel loop. I couldn't scrub them out with bleach or drown them in dishwater. They lived inside me now, part of the air I breathed in that apartment. The days blurred into a monotonous cycle of chores and quiet suffering. My presence was tolerated, my efforts unseen. One afternoon, rain began to fall in long silver sheets. Sarah had forgotten to pick up milk. I didn't ask. I put on my old rain jacket, thin as tissue, and walked the 6 blocks to the store. The cold rain hit like tiny slaps against my face. My shoes soaked through in minutes, but I kept walking. The milk was heavy in the plastic bag as I carried it home. On the way back, I slipped slightly on the slick sidewalk. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make my heart jump. I held onto a mailbox until the pavement stopped spinning. My fingers were numb, my knees aching. When I stepped through the door, dripping onto the entryway tile, Sarah glanced at me from the couch. "You went out in that?" she asked, not with concern, but irritation. I sneezed, half laughing, trying to shake off the chill. She didn't smile, just muttered, "If you slip and break something, it's going to be a whole mess. You should have just waited." I stood there for a second, still holding the milk. Water pulled around my shoes. I realized she wasn't scolding me for getting sick. She was warning me not to become a problem. I wasn't a guest. I wasn't family. I was a potential liability. I dried off in the hallway. No one asked if I was okay. No one looked up when I walked past the living room to put the milk in the fridge. That night, when I sat at the kitchen table alone, towel wrapping my feet and sipping reheated tea, I looked at the little blister on my hand and thought, at least this hurt makes sense. That night, I lay on the tin mattress on the floor of my grandson's room. The ceiling above me blurred in the dim glow of the hallway light that spilled through the cracked door. My blanket was too short, my feet cold, and my hands curled stiffly against my chest, wrinkled purple from the chill. I stared at them for a long time, barely blinking. These were the same hands that once held Mark's feverish body against mine when he was just a baby, the same hands that sewed patches into his jeans when he scuffed them playing in the yard. Now they looked like someone else's, forgotten relics that no longer belonged. Sarah's words echoed again as they did every night. "You're just keeping her here to make use of her." No one repeated it aloud, but it was there. In the silence when I entered her room, in the brief glance when I dropped a plate, in the way Sarah pulled her coffee mug out of my hands before I could refill it. I wasn't a guest. I wasn't even unwanted. I was tolerated like an old appliance, too heavy to move, too functional to throw away. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come. I thought of David, my David, and the way he used to quietly sand down the wooden stair rail each winter so it wouldn't splinter. How he always reached out a hand when I stepped off the porch, even when I was still young and steady. He never said much, but his presence spoke louder than any comfort I've known since. With him, I had worth. Not because I was useful, but because I was his. Because I was Eleanor. Now, in this sleek apartment with its humming refrigerator and flat-screen TV, I felt like an undocumented stranger. No one had stripped me of my identity outright, but I had somehow become invisible. No language, no country, no right to speak. I wasn't angry about the money. I wasn't angry about the couch, the chores, the silence. I was angry about being reduced to a function. After all the years I had poured into my family, every meal, every scraped knee, every sleepless night, I had become a convenience, not a mother, not a person. The streetlight poured in through the window, casting a long, pale line across the floor. I sat in that glow, unmoving, hollowed out. And in that hush of early morning, I whispered to the dark, "Maybe it's time I left." The words, though spoken softly, carried the weight of a monumental decision. The silence in the apartment swallowed them, but in my heart, they resonated with a newfound resolve. 2 days later, I knocked lightly on Mark's door, my voice soft but steady. "I've been thinking," I said, "I might go back to Maplewood for a few days, visit my cousin Louise." He looked surprised, blinking like he just missed something obvious. "What for?" Everything okay, Mom? I gave him a small smile. It's just a little cramped here, that's all. I'm used to more space, fewer people. It was a gentle lie, not meant to wound, not even meant to stir guilt, just a way of easing myself out without asking for permission. I'd already made peace with the truth. If I waited for someone to ask me to stay, I might never leave. From the kitchen, Sarah called out without turning around. "That's a good idea, Mom. A little fresh air might do you some good." Her voice carried a hint of relief, coated in casual politeness. Not cruel, just done. I heard it for what it was, not an insult, but an exhale, and it cut deeper than any harsh word. I packed quietly the next morning. A few spring sweaters, my bottle of headache pills, the faded wedding photo of David and me. The savings book stayed folded inside the hem of my purse, still untouched, still in my name. I didn't need much. I had already left most of myself behind. When I wheeled my suitcase toward the door, no one followed, no arms wrapped around me, no goodbyes. Only my little grandson, barefoot in his pajamas, came running up the hallway. He hugged my leg tightly, kissed my cheek with a sticky mouth, and whispered, "Grandma, don't forget my toy car." I crouched down to kiss the top of his head. My hand trembled slightly as I tucked a curl behind his ear. I didn't cry, not in front of him. The tears stayed hidden, pressing into my palms as I clutched that old photo to my chest. I wasn't grieving the departure. I was mourning the dream that had kept me going all these years, one where love alone was enough to bind people together. As the bus pulled away from the station, I sat by the window and watched the city melt behind layers of glass and smog. Horns, construction, hurried lives. It all shrank into the background like the end of a film I'd stayed too long to finish. Nothing was holding me there anymore, no room left for a mother, no space for anything but silence. The farther we drove, the clearer the sky became. The fields opened up like familiar arms. Patches of rice and soy stretched toward the horizon, glistening under soft clouds. The scent of soil and spring drifted in through a cracked window. My lungs filled differently, fuller, less filtered. It was the air of my own beginnings. And I realized in that moment that I didn't need to explain myself anymore. Not to Mark, not to Sarah, not to anyone. I wasn't leaving in anger. I wasn't escaping. I was returning not just to Harmony Creek, but to the part of myself I had locked away long ago for the sake of being needed. The land outside rolled gently like it remembered me, and I let it hold me again quietly, without question. When I stepped off the bus in Maplewood, the air felt lighter, even if it was thick with early spring pollen. My knees ached from the ride, and the handle of my suitcase had left a deep red mark on my fingers. But then I saw her, Louise, waiting on the curb in her old knitted shawl, her hair pinned up just like back in high school. She walked right up to me without a word and pulled me into a tight hug. "You came home," she said into my ear. Her voice cracked with time, but her arms hadn't changed. She held on like I was something precious returned, not something broken fleeing. In that moment, I wasn't Mark's mother, Sarah's nuisance, or some quiet shadow sneaking around an apartment. I was just Eleanor, her Eleanor. No pretense, no utility. Her house was a small, weathered cabin on the edge of town. The paint had peeled in places, and the screen door wheezed when it opened. But when I placed my bags down and sank into the creaky rocking chair on her porch, I exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. The cushions were faded, the wood groaned under my weight, but nothing in that space asked anything from me. The air smelled like pine and damp soil. In the distance, I could hear a chainsaw, probably from old Mr. Jenkins' farm, and the whistle of a freight train sliding through the valley. Louise handed me a warm mug of chamomile tea, then let me sit in silence. The sun slanted low through the chestnut trees, casting gentle light over the porch steps. The wind carried a few lazy leaves in circles near my feet, and as the light faded, the only sounds left were the chirping of sparrows and the soft rustle of wind sneaking through the rafters. I leaned my head back, pulled the shawl tighter around my shoulders, and closed my eyes. For the first time in months, I fell asleep. Not out of exhaustion, not because my body had given out, but because I was at peace. The kind of sleep that doesn't come from silence, but from the absence of fear. No one was watching me. No one was waiting for me to finish the dishes or pick up the baby or get out of the way. No one needed me. And yet, I felt more whole than I had in a long, long time. In the days that followed, life in Maplewood gently embraced me, stitching up the deep wounds that Chicago had left behind. My mornings were simple and humble, washing my face with cold water drawn from the old backyard pump, the icy shock waking me gently. Breakfast was never elaborate, usually slices of toast and homemade pickled cucumbers or Louise's famous dill pickle sandwiches, but the warmth of sharing it together made it taste like a feast. Louise's soft voice asking me, "Did you sleep all right, Eleanor?" became the reassuring music I'd wake to each morning, so different from the indifferent murmurs back at Mark's. Evenings found us sitting quietly on the creaking porch, hands busy sorting beans or shelling peas, but our minds calm and content. The sun dipping below the horizon painted everything of soft golden hue, and the gentle, rhythmic clinking of pods dropping into metal bowls felt like therapy. My back often complained quietly, aches reminding me of my age, but Louise was always there, quick to fetch a cushion or offer her arm for support. Here, each ache became a reminder that I was still here, still wanted, still cherished. Around town, the familiar faces greeted me with genuine smiles and lingering curiosity. Neighbors would wave, hollering from across fences or roads, "Eleanor, you're back! Life in the city must have been good to you, huh?" Their friendly voices held a gentle teasing I'd known since childhood. I smiled back, hiding the bitter memories behind a carefully constructed mask. How could I tell them the truth? That I'd been nothing but a ghost in my own son's home, my worth measured in chores completed rather than affection returned. So I nodded politely, murmured vague pleasantries, and left the conversation at that. One afternoon, as Louise and I were shelling peas, her teenage grandson, Ben, bounded up the porch steps, eyes sparkling with youthful excitement. "Grandma Eleanor, you used to cook professionally, didn't you?" he asked breathlessly, holding up his phone. I raised an eyebrow skeptically, nodding cautiously. "Well," he continued eagerly, "what if you and Grandma Louise do some cooking videos on TikTok? I'll help you film. People would love it. You could be famous." I laughed softly, shaking my head at his youthful enthusiasm. "Ben, who would watch an old lady cooking dinner?" But Ben's hopeful face was impossible to deny. Louise shrugged with a mischievous smile, clearly already on board. "Oh, Eleanor," she chuckled. "What's the worst that could happen? We burn something and give people a good laugh." And so, nervously, I found myself standing in front of Ben's phone camera that very evening. My hands trembled, spilling fish broth over the counter. My tongue stumbled over ingredients, completely forgetting what spices I needed. I was painfully aware that only a handful of people were watching, the tiny number in the corner of the screen telling me exactly how few. But surprisingly gentle, encouraging comments began trickling in. "Grandma, you're adorable," said one viewer. "Your voice sounds just like my granny's. Made my heart warm," typed another. Each kind word softened my embarrassment, easing the tightness in my chest. Louise laughed beside me, her warmth contagious, making my fumbling seem less catastrophic and more charming. "See," she teased, nudging me gently, "you're a star." Encouraged, the next evening we tried again. This time I told little stories from my past as I stirred soups or chopped vegetables. My voice grew steadier as I shared how my husband David used to adore my hearty beef stew, his favorite meal after a long day at the factory. I recounted memories of my youngest, Mark, crying out for my chicken noodle soup whenever he was feverish as a child, his little hands clutching mine. I even shared a humorous story about the disastrous summer when my prized tomato plants wilted because I mistakenly used fresh chicken manure instead of compost. The audience laughed along, their warmth palpable even through the small screen. A few evenings later, I prepared my famous pickled okra, chatting casually to the invisible faces watching. My mother taught me this, I began softly, feeling the gentle sting of nostalgia. I didn't think much of it, just another humble recipe shared. Another quiet evening spent in Louise's cozy kitchen. But then, almost overnight, something astonishing happened. Ben burst into the house the next morning, eyes wide with excitement, waving his phone wildly. "Grandma, Eleanor, you've gone viral," he shouted breathlessly. "The ochre video, it has over 200,000 views." I stared at him blankly for a moment, my heart fluttering uncertainly. Ben handed me the phone, and I scrolled slowly through the comments, stunned by the flood of heartfelt messages. People from across the country were reaching out, thanking me, saying how much I reminded them of their mothers and grandmothers. One woman from Texas wrote something that made my heart clench softly. "You remind me of my mom who passed away last year. Thank you for bringing her memory back to life." My eyes stung with sudden tears, and I sat down abruptly, hands trembling. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen. I wasn't merely useful, not someone to be taken for granted or quietly forgotten. Instead, I was someone who mattered. Someone whose simple stories and humble meals could warm hearts miles away. The realization swept over me like a gentle cleansing wave, washing away the bitter memories and hidden disappointments. I looked around the cozy kitchen, Louise quietly smiling as she watched my reaction, Ben practically vibrating with excitement, the fading sunlight casting a soft glow over worn wooden cupboards. And for the first time, I felt truly awake. My life hadn't ended with rejection. It had simply taken a quiet detour back home to a place where I was loved and accepted exactly as I was. The first time I held the money earned from my pickled okra jars, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a grand sum, just a modest stack of bills, but its weight felt different from any paycheck I'd received before. This money hadn't come from pity nor from quiet charity disguised as gratitude. This was something purely mine, born from my own hands, my stories, my truth. Tears blurred my eyes, and I gently pressed the money to my chest, savoring the quiet pride blossoming inside me. I found myself wandering through Maplewood's tiny shops later that afternoon, guided only by an impulse I'd always stifled. My eyes landed on a delicate lavender-colored wool scarf displayed in the window of Miss Eleanor's shop. I hesitated, fingers brushing the soft, luxurious threads. An old woman like me, what would I need something pretty for? Yet this time the voice of doubt faded quickly. For once, it wasn't about necessity or practicality or even about pleasing someone else. It was simply about allowing myself a small pleasure, something beautiful chosen solely for me. That evening, wrapped snugly in my new scarf, I sat before the old vanity in Louise's spare bedroom. The mirror reflected a woman I barely recognized. Her hair was still silver and thin, her face still lined with gentle creases of time and experience, but her eyes? Those eyes sparkled with newfound strength, clarity, and purpose. The scarf, soft and fragrant with hints of lavender, framed her face gracefully, emphasizing not age or weariness, but quiet dignity and joy. I leaned closer, examining myself with gentle wonder. For years, I had been defined solely by the roles I fulfilled. David's wife, Mark's mother, caretaker, cook, maid. But in that moment, I saw none of those labels. There was only me, Eleanor, her Eleanor, a woman who had finally begun to embrace her own worth, unshadowed by anyone else's identity or needs. From that moment, each day unfolded gently, like the turning of pages in a cherished old book, filled with rediscoveries of joy and meaning. My small videos quietly began to spread across the internet, drawing in more strangers, yet somehow making them feel like friends. I continued carefully writing down my recipes, noting the little stories attached to each, the beef stew that David always requested when the winter wind blew cold through the walls of our old home, the cornmeal porridge I gently spoon-fed Mark through feverish nights when he was a child, even the salty sliced ham that Cheryl once pushed aside with a reluctant sigh. It wasn't about lingering in bitterness or reliving disappointment. Each recipe was simply a part of me, a moment in time preserved like a pressed flower, delicate yet enduring. Every evening, after dinner with Luis, I'd sit at the kitchen table under the comforting hum of the old ceiling fan, jotting down thoughts in my notebook, a ritual I titled Things I've Learned After 75. The entries ranged from practical lessons about navigating live stream buttons and carefully packaging my homemade preserves, to softer reflections about what it means to start anew when most believe your life story is long past its climax. Each entry felt like a quiet act of defiance against invisibility, proof that age was no boundary for discovery or purpose. Saturday evenings became something we both eagerly anticipated. Louise and I would tie bright scarves around our heads, laughing at our reflections as we prepared to livestream our weekly cooking session. I found comfort in her familiar, teasing presence as we stood side by side in her small kitchen, steam curling from pots on the stove and the air fragrant with onions and herbs. As the cameras started, we'd banter gently about our younger days, letting laughter bubble naturally into the conversation. The screen would fill with small red hearts, each one like a tiny applause, a quiet affirmation that there was still warmth and connection to be found. One evening, as the amber sunset painted the sky beyond Louise's window, I began with a soft breath in the warm, low tones I'd grown accustomed to sharing. Today, I said, carefully dusting flour from my hands onto a worn apron, I'm making butterfish, a recipe my mother-in-law taught me. She wasn't much for words, but she guided my hands with such gentle certainty. Each motion a wordless lesson. As I spoke, I felt the room fall gently into silence. Even the digital chatter stilled, replaced by tender emojis and a steady stream of silent, heartfelt reactions. It wasn't just the recipe, it was the memory I evoked, fragile yet vivid, that resonated deeply. There was no showmanship, only honesty. And perhaps that's what moved the hearts of those watching. A few weeks later, an invitation arrived, elegant but modest, to speak at the Clay County Senior Citizens Gathering. The envelope trembled in my hands for a moment before I steadied myself. On the appointed day, I wore my soft lavender dress, wrapping myself gently in the scarf I'd chosen, the comforting fabric grounding me. Louis squeezed my hand before I stepped onto the small stage. My heart fluttered, not from anxiety, but from a quiet sense of awe. For the first time, I stood before others, not as David's widow or Mark's mother, but simply as myself. The words came without notes, as though they'd always waited patiently within me for this moment. Growing old isn't the end, I told the quiet audience, faces lined with understanding and eyes shimmering with silent agreement. It can be the most beautiful chapter if we allow ourselves to rewrite it with our own hands. I spoke not to teach, not even to inspire deliberately, but simply to share a truth I'd stumbled upon after a lifetime of waiting in the shadows of others. My humble speech was recorded and quietly spread through our small town and beyond. The gentle power of authenticity seemed to ripple outwards, touching more hearts than I'd ever expected. Soon I saw messages appearing on my phone, words of gratitude, quiet confessions of regret, and stories of reconnection. One young woman wrote, "Because of you, I finally called my mother after 10 years. I never understood until I heard your story." Another wrote simply, "My mom was like you, always there, always overlooked. I'm thinking differently now." They began calling me Grandma Eleanor, the heart of small-town America, and at first I felt overwhelmed. But gradually, that feeling settled into quiet humility and gratitude. I didn't consider myself special or remarkable. I'd simply found my voice after decades of silence. Yet somehow, my quiet courage to be seen and heard had become a lifeline for others. One evening, sitting on the porch, Louise handed me a mug of steaming tea, looking thoughtfully into the distance. "You know, Eleanor," she said gently, "you've become a real inspiration around here." I sipped the tea, warm and comforting against the chill of the evening air, smiling softly. "I didn't mean to be, Louise," I murmured quietly. "I was just trying to live, to remember who I was before the world told me who to be." Louise patted my hand gently, understanding in her touch. And maybe that's why people love listening so much. You're reminding them that their own stories matter too. I gazed at the fading light, quiet but content, knowing that if every scar I'd carried could guide someone else away from their own pain, then all I'd endured had purpose. I leaned back in the creaky old porch chair, feeling more present, more deeply alive than ever before, and knew this quiet strength, this newfound peace, was what my story had been building toward all along. One quiet afternoon, as golden sunlight streamed through Louise's old lace curtains and the scent of vinegar and dill filled the room, my phone vibrated softly against the worn wood of the kitchen table. My fingers, still damp from wiping the rim of a mason jar, hesitated above the glowing screen. It took a moment for my eyes to focus clearly on the name that appeared. Mark, calling. The sight of it twisted something deep inside me, a pang of hesitation mixed with a faint hope I had long stopped nurturing. The phone vibrated again, persistent and patient. Taking a deep breath, I gently pressed the screen, bringing the phone to my ear. The line crackled softly, filled with hesitant silence. Neither of us spoke at first, as if words had become strangers we needed to reintroduce ourselves to. My heartbeat was measured and steady, but beneath my quiet composure lay a guarded apprehension. Finally, Mark's voice emerged from the silence, husky, almost fragile. "Mom," he whispered, as though afraid the word itself might break. "I just saw your speech online. I had no idea." It hurt to hear it. "I didn't know." His voice trailed off, leaving a space that neither of us rushed to fill. It was clear the years between us had created a gulf so wide simple apologies could no longer cross it. I felt no bitterness, just a quiet acknowledgement of a pain that had long ago settled into acceptance. He was my son, and I would always love him, but that love was now tempered by clarity. He continued softly, almost as if speaking to himself. "How did I not see how much you were suffering, Mom? You were right there in front of me, and I was blind." There was emptiness inside me as I listened, not because his words hurt, but because they came so late. They were like raindrops on land parched beyond rescue, sincere, yet unable to reverse the damage already done. I didn't comfort him, nor did I admonish him. Some truths could only be learned through personal reckoning. After another lingering pause, Mark's voice rose again, cautiously hopeful. "Can you forgive me, Mom?" I closed my eyes, feeling my shoulders relax, an invisible weight slipping from me as I spoke gently into the phone. "Mark, I'm not angry anymore. I was just hurt because I always believed you understood me." My voice held no resentment, just a quiet release, a gentle permission to move forward without me holding him back or me held captive by past wounds. Another silence filled the line, softer this time, less strained. Mark breathed deeply, gathering courage. "How are you these days?" "Sarah and I were thinking we might come down to visit soon. She talks about you often, says she owes you a proper apology." My reply was calm, steady, and sure. "If you both want to visit, you're welcome too, but know this. The woman you'll meet now isn't the mother you knew back then. I'm different, Mark. My life isn't waiting for approval anymore." He seemed taken aback, yet oddly relieved. "You're a real celebrity now," he chuckled lightly, half incredulous. "People at work talk about you all the time." I smiled faintly to myself, holding tightly to the simple dignity I'd reclaimed. "I'm not famous," I corrected softly. "I just finally decided to be me. Not your mom, not David's widow, just Eleanor. And if that inspires others, I'm glad." "I wish I'd understood sooner," Mark murmured quietly, an undercurrent of regret threading through his words. "Maybe you understand now," I said gently but firmly. "It took me a lifetime to learn that if you don't value yourself, no one else can do it for you." There was no promise, no plan set in stone when the call ended, just a gentle click in the quiet rustling of leaves outside my window. The breeze whispered gently through the branches, an echo of the calm acceptance I felt. Perhaps Mark and Sarah would visit, perhaps not. It mattered little now. The bonds of obligation and expectation had finally loosened, and I stood free within myself. The next morning, with a sense of clear resolve, I dressed carefully in a crisp white blouse, brushing my silver hair into place. Louise offered me an encouraging nod from the kitchen table as I stepped out onto the porch and down the familiar road toward the bus stop. The office of Mr. Peterson, the local lawyer, was located in a modest brick building nestled in a quiet corner of our town square. As I sat across from him, my hands folded neatly in my lap, I calmly explained my intentions to draw up a will, dividing equally the modest legacy I'd inherited from my parents, the small plot of land, and the tidy savings I'd quietly guarded over the years. Mr. Peterson peered at me thoughtfully over his half-moon spectacles. "Eleanor," he asked gently, "are you sure about this? Maybe keep a little something just for yourself." A soft smile eased across my face as I shook my head. "Mr. Peterson, the part worth keeping, the part truly mine. I'm already living every single day." There was no bitterness, no grand gesture of rejection. This was simply my choice, clear, deliberate, and quiet. He nodded slowly, understanding without needing further explanation, and began preparing the documents. As his pen moved methodically across the pages, a peaceful sense of liberation wrapped gently around me. It was not the act of letting go that felt freeing, but the recognition that material things had ceased to hold power over my happiness. Stepping out of the lawyer's office later, the morning sun greeted me warmly, illuminating the path ahead with clear, bright promise. The weightlessness I felt wasn't from what I'd given away, but from the clarity I had finally gained. Life was unfolding anew, each step forward taken without the shadow of old disappointments, old wounds, or old burdens. I walked back toward Louise's house slowly, savoring the simple beauty around me, the familiar hum of neighbors' greetings, the scent of wildflowers along the roadside, the comforting crunch of gravel beneath my shoes. In that quiet moment, the world was no longer a place I navigated in cautious silence. Instead, it was a landscape to be explored openly, freely, and fearlessly. No longer as someone's wife or mother, but as Eleanor herself, content in her own quiet strength,